So I guess maybe we'll get started because it is 11:30 and I want to respect everybody's time. So first, thank you so much for being here today. I am Jenny Seifert. I am a watershed outreach specialist at UW-Madison Division of Extension, working as part of under the North Central Region Water Network. And I'm joined here today with my collaborator, John Pennington. I don't know, John, do you want to introduce yourself real quick? Oh, John, you're on mute.
I usually introduce myself on mute first to make sure I don't get in any trouble, but John Pennington, University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture, and proud to be a part of this program with everybody today.
Awesome, thanks, John. All right, so just to remind yourselves of why you're here to learn about Tap Your Potential. It's a training to grow farmer leadership and watershed management. And I'm excited to talk to you today about it. So I'm gonna have a little bit of a presentation first, just to give you the rundown about the curriculum and how it can sort of help your programming. And then we have a short panel discussion with two folks who participated in pilot runs of this curriculum, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So that's what the next 45 minutes to an hour is going to look like for us. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. So, you know, we all know that farmers are part of the solution for achieving clean water and healthy landscapes. This is not something I need to tell this crowd, but this is sort of, you know, the why behind this curriculum. And I'm sure many of you are already working actively with farmers in sort of support of clean water goals. And I am sure you all already know farmer leaders. These are your go-to farmers, you know, that the farmer that is really leading the way with cover crops in your watershed, or the farmer who is always gracious to host a field day, or perhaps it's somebody who's super motivated and they've put together a watershed group or a soil health group. So you might already know folks who sort of fall in this category of farmer leader. And, you know, as some of you probably also know, you know, there's a lot of knowledge behind farmer leadership and why it's important. This is just some of the sort of theories behind, just to get a little geeky, some of the theories behind farmer leadership, which really comes down to peer-to-peer learning and learning from our peers and our social networks. And so some of you might be familiar with some of the science behind social norms and opinion leaders, and this theory called the diffusion of innovations and how they influence people and their behavior. And so this is just some of the why, again, behind what we're talking about today. One thing that I think we all might agree on is that we need to know how to empower more farmers, especially if we're going to be meeting water quality goals. We always can't. The challenge is we can't always tap the same farmers. For the most part, farmer leaders are volunteering their time, and some of the challenges of sustaining farmer leadership are about the same as any volunteer effort. And some of those challenges might include combating leadership fatigue. So, you know, again, the farmer who is always asked to do things might not be able to always do those things. So how do we sustain group energy? And then finally, how do we reach beyond the choir? And so my guess is that some of you might be experiencing some of these challenges today, and, you know, are asking, how can we be motivating more farmers and how can we broaden the base? And so really this curriculum is trying to answer this need. And so again, this is about how we can inspire more farmers to be leaders in watershed management. The goal of this curriculum, again, is called Tap Your Potential, a training to grow farmer leadership and watershed management. The goal is to really equip farmers with the knowledge and inspiration to become more involved in watershed management efforts. And what does farmer leadership look like? The sort of bullet points on this slide come from a report that you see with a link at the bottom of the page, and I can send this link out later afterwards. But it's basically, it looked at sort of what are the ways that farmers can lead. It identified 3, and sort of later a 4th came on to it. But briefly, farmers can, basically at a big picture level, leadership is not just standing at the podium, giving the speech and rallying the troops. There are many ways that anybody can lead, and especially farmers. So farmers can first of all lead by example, by the practices that they adopt on their operations. They can lead in a peer-to-peer way, and that means things like hosting field days at their farms, being part of virtual events, being mentors, having conversations at coffee shops. They can lead as consultants, for example, serving on advisory groups. And then finally, they can have sort of more formal leadership roles in sort of a decision-making sphere that sort of, they're part of sort of determining strategies and sort of directing resources. So these are the sort of some of the ways that farmers can lead, and sort of how this curriculum helps to guide farmers towards these directions. So if it's not already obvious, the target audiences for this curriculum for Tap Your Potential are farmers, but they are also farm advisors. We know that farm advisors often come to events that are meant to attract farmers, and we hope for farmers that it serves as a gateway to some form of leadership role. And then for farmer advisors, we hope that it offers them ideas for engaging and supporting farmers and their own involvement in watershed projects. So in the big picture, these are sort of the learning objectives of the curriculum. They include, hopefully by the end of the curriculum, the participants have a greater awareness of how farmers can lead. They have a greater understanding of water quality problems and the importance for farmer involvement in those solutions. They hopefully, the curriculum instills a personal recognition of how they might want to lead, and then also provide some motivation for seeking out leadership opportunities and connections. And then something else that is sort of central to this curriculum is this idea of watershed thinking, thinking in terms of in watershed terms, which I think, we can all agree is not common among most people. And it really, the content helps to cultivate this among the folks who are taking the training. So it is really framed around the Mississippi Atchafalaya River Basin. That is primarily because this project represents collaborative efforts of SARA 46. And for those who are unfamiliar with SARA 46, it is a committee of extension educators and researchers in the Mississippi River Basin that work in sort of conjunction with the Hypoxia Task Force around reducing nutrient loads to the Mississippi River and shrinking the Gulf of Mexico's hypoxic zone. So that was sort of, and EPA funded the development of this curriculum, so that is sort of some of the rationale behind that. But also in the curriculum, we really tried to strike a balance between this broader big basin context and the local context, because we do know that the local context is what people often care about. But then there's also an important need to sort of connect people to that bigger picture. So we tried to find that balance. So I'm just going to go over just quickly the basic structure of the curriculum, just to give you a sense for what's in it. There are 3 modules, and basically it takes farmers through a journey of really shaping their own inner narrative about what leadership means for them and what they can do to make a difference for water quality. So the first module is called the What, Why, and How of Farmer Leadership to Protect Water. And that is really about exploring what leadership means and how farmers can be leaders in watershed management. The second module is intended to help farmers learn the language of watershed management and feel comfortable in those conversations. So it's a little bit into the science of watersheds and watershed management. And the final module is really, it focuses on solutions where farmers can make a difference and can play a role in helping to meet water quality goals. That said, you don't have to follow, if you're using this curriculum, you don't have to follow this format exactly, which I'll get into more later. You can certainly mix modules around, mix sections of the modules around, and maybe use only 1 or 2 depending on your audiences and their needs. And I do want to note here, I know a question is probably people are asking is, how much time does, this training take, and how much time should you plan for? And so if you were to deliver all 3 modules in their entirety, we do recommend 2 hours per module. So that's about 6 hours total. And then Another important thing to know is that there was a lot of intention to turn the content that you're delivering into conversation, and as you all probably know already and have experienced, the conversation is really where some of the most rich or the richest learning can happen. I mean, so there in the curriculum there are places for reflection, there are places for discussion, and each module has an activity that both encourages the conversation, but then also helps participants really apply what they're learning to their own lives, their own farms, and their own communities. And so very briefly, those activities, the first one is called Influential People, and that's part of module 1, and that's really about helping participants identify their sphere of influence in their community and who are the influential people in their community. A vision for the future is for module 2, and that's really helping participants really envision what they want for the future of their watershed and how can they see themselves in that vision for the future. And then finally, the watershed asset map is similar to, if you're familiar with the community asset map, it's just sort of applying it to the watershed context, but it's helping participants identify some of the assets in their community that can help them achieve their goals with their water quality or soil health efforts. And one thing I also want to encourage is in terms of encouraging conversation is we're also encouraging a two-way learning environment. So if you do decide to use this curriculum and facilitate a training, to try to capture some of the common themes and divergent perspectives or standout ideas that come out of the conversations to really create this, so you can also learn from your participants. And very briefly, I wanted to go over sort of the components of the curriculum if you have not already downloaded it. And this was created by a team of extension educators and outreach specialists. And so we really tried to think through all the things that someone might need to facilitate this training. We wanted to make it as usable off the shelf as possible. And so the curriculum contains a facilitator's guide, which really walks you through how to organize the training and with tips for delivering it both in person and virtually. Obviously, it contains the modules, which are PowerPoint presentations. That are customizable. It contains a participants packet, which is essentially a take-home resource for your training participants. And that has, contains some of the main messages and some spaces for note-taking, and that's also customizable. There's a template for a completion certificate if you want to use one of those, and there's a graphic for marketing the curriculum. And I want to come back to this notion that this curriculum is really about really customizable. We recognize that we can't make this one size fits all, and that you're going to have to customize it to your own local context. And so you can customize both the content and the delivery of the curriculum. First of all, there's sort of and I alluded to this earlier, there is a plug and play format. So that means that you can rearrange sections, you can omit slides, you can create your own sections, et cetera. So you can make it, tailor it to your needs. We've also flagged slides to signal where you can bring in some local context, so that it makes it easier for you to find those places. While we have included a bunch of imagery and photos in the slides, we also encourage you to use locally appropriate photos, maybe of your own watershed, for example. We encourage the use of guest speakers, so from your local area or your state, to bring in those voices. And then finally, it is, I mentioned earlier, it is adaptable to both an in-person and a virtual delivery. And again, in the facilitators guide, we offer some tips on how to do it both ways. And another note I want to sort of make about delivery is that we encourage you to really think about how to fit the training into sort of the time constraints of your participants. So for example, it can be done as a standalone training, or you could also integrate it into existing meetings. So if you have a group that already meets, you can think about how to integrate it into those meetings already. And I just want to reiterate sort of this idea of striking a balance between the local context and the big picture. It's something that we talked about a lot as a sort of a development team is, the local stuff really matters, and we recognize that, and that's what resonates most. But then it also matters to sort of help participants see themselves in this bigger picture of the larger Mississippi River watershed. So some potential uses, and my guess is that you all came to this today because you're interested in using something like this in your programming. And so, these are some ways that we envision as a team that this could be used. And, obviously there might be other ways that you envision, but it can be used to recruit farmers to be involved in local watershed projects. It can help a group of farmers form a farmer-led watershed group. It could help an existing group recruit new members. It can help showcase opportunities for leadership to a young farmers group. It can help educate farm advisors on how they and farmers can be more engaged in watershed management. And again, you might think of other ways to use this curriculum. And I just want to really briefly touch on, so I mentioned earlier, we did pilot the training twice, and we're going to meet a couple of folks who were part of that in a few minutes. But I just wanted to share some of the results of those pilot runs. We did evaluate them to sort of see, was it meeting our goals, and then B, what kinds of changes might have resulted. And I want to highlight a couple here. One is that there was evidence that it increased awareness among participants around several things, including how to be a leader, reasons why farmer leadership is important, water quality issues, and terms and approaches of watershed management. And then it also exhibited sort of increase in motivation among participants to pursue new leadership opportunities, such as getting involved with partners and agencies or promoting practices to other farmers. And then before we transition to our panel, I just want to offer a few delivery tips that are sort of based on what we learned from our pilot runs of the curriculum, and hopefully they're helpful to you. One thing that we found is it's really important to prioritize time for breakout discussions and always err on the side of more conversation. We found, a lot of the richest learning can come from those conversations. We did find, and this is probably not surprising given I keep talking about it, but using local and practical information to connect the content with farmers' lives is also really important. Including farmer stories. So again, I mentioned earlier the idea of having guest speakers. So you could, for example, invite a farmer who's already sort of showing leadership in your area to come tell their story. We also recommend not trying to avoid falling into the weeds of technical content. And in module 2, especially, there is an area of really sort of talking about some of the science and modeling behind watershed management, and we think that's really can be really important for participants to know and to learn, but then to avoid sort of getting into the weeds that you might lose people. And then finally, I think following up with your participants is really important. And this is especially important if you're doing the training over multiple days, following up with folks in between, but then also following up afterwards with folks to really find out how they've applied what they've learned. And so without further ado, we are going to hear from a couple of folks who were part of our pilot runs. And then after this short panel, we're going to have Q&A, because I'm sure that you all have some questions about the curriculum. And so I'm going to introduce one of them, and then I'm going to let John introduce the second one. So we did pilot the curriculum in 2 different places. So one was done in person. So this was in the before times of COVID in Arkansas. And then our second pilot run was done during COVID, and that forced us to learn how to adapt this to a virtual environment. And that was done in Ohio in the Upper Scioto watershed. And so Mark Wilson is our Ohio representative. He's from American Farmland Trust, the Farming for Clean Water project manager. And then Jeff Marley was in Arkansas. He's the board president of Beaver Watershed Alliance. And I'm going to turn the mic over to John to talk a little bit first about the pilot run in Arkansas, because he facilitated it.
Thanks, Jenny. Great rundown of the curriculum and why we made it. And this is a Mississippi Basin, a Atchafalaya River Basin wide effort. And it's part of a multi-state effort to increase farmer watershed leadership throughout the watershed, throughout the basin. And as I introduce Jeff, the board president of the Beaver Watershed Alliance. First, I'd like to just make everybody aware that Jeff is a farmer. He's a discovery farmer here in Arkansas. So he's been a peer leader for a while, showing off what he does and encouraging other people to do that. And so the Beaver Watershed Alliance is a well-developed watershed organization. They're a younger organization, but in their short history, I believe they incorporated in 2011, and we are in 2021. They've got a measurable way to show water quality improvements. They have delisted a stream in the watershed for its impairment through their approach. And they've developed a sustainable funding source that can pay for people and projects every year. And this is in partnership with a water district that sells water, and they feel like investing in the land to keep the water clean is better than treating it after it gets to the intake. And so the Beaver Watershed Alliance works with this stakeholder and other stakeholders to improve the water quality for Northwest Arkansas, which is 1 in 6 Arkansans, basically, and all of the businesses and communities. And Jeff, being a farmer and being a board president on a watershed organization that's so well developed in such a short amount of time shows his skill and their skill. And so when we were piloting this curriculum to them, they were more of an audience that has seen the roadmap, used it, and achieved. Still yet, there's room for learning within their watershed, within the organization, but maybe not as much as in a place where there's not much watershed management activities going on yet. And so it was a little bit of a challenge to get any kind of learning or improvement out of doing this program in person. But there were some improvements for participants. I think everybody maybe learned, I think some more than others, and the results were good. And really taking the input from this group, from what all of us in extension, from Kentucky to Wisconsin, Ohio, and Iowa and Arkansas, what we think we need, and then hearing back from the farmer on the ground what they feel like is important, what they feel like works. That's really where it's at. So working with people, getting real-time feedback. And so that is really where our training came in to pilot this program. And then with that said, I will let Jeff maybe talk about some of the things that he thought about the program. I think we've got some maybe questions for him as well a little bit later. Jenny, do you want to let Jeff talk about it for a second, or do you want to kind of ask questions, or do you want to introduce Mark and then do questions?
Yeah, maybe let's, I'll introduce Mark, and then I think that the questions that I have for Jeff are definitely gonna we'll get into things. And then what I'll do is I'll alternate between Jeff and Mark, so they both have an opportunity to be sharing what they got out of the experience. And so I guess I'll let Mark Wilson, I'm gonna let you do more introduction of yourself. I mean, we collaborated with Mark. So the sort of difference in this second pilot run was that we collaborated with Mark at the American Farmland Trust, as well as the City of Columbus. So to actually facilitate the training sort of in partnership with them. And their watershed's a little bit of a different stage than the Beaver watershed. And I don't know, Mark, if you want to talk a little bit about sort of about the farmer engagement work that you're doing in the Upper Scioto, and sort of how you hoped that Tap Your Potential could help support that work.
Sure, thank you, Jenny. First, I'm an agronomist, a private consultant, and I'm also a project manager for American Farmland Trust. We have a project in the Upper Scioto River watershed, which essentially feeds the City of Columbus. Our project is in its second year. We've formed a very active advisory group that is comprised already of individuals that have leadership experience. And they were the primary audience for this curriculum. And I'll be glad to share more about feedback we got from them and about our project as time allows.
Great, thanks, Mark. So Jeff, I'm going to start with a question for you. Can you tell us one or two things that you got out of participating in the pilot training?
Yeah, thank you all. One of the first things was the exposure and the importance we weren't aware of all the, some of the stuff that was going on in the drainage. I mean, and so that's the first thing before you can do anything. You have to be aware of it. We weren't aware of, the dead zone down in the Gulf and all the others and several other things that were brought to our attention. Then, of course, the thing is, it was so broad reaching and covering so much area. And that was just almost an immediate, and you covered a lot of that early on. Wow, it was literally the wow factor. Wow, how do you reach out and touch all those individuals that might have that will have an influence on, trying to lessen the impact of the what we were talking about. And then, and that got into some lengthy conversations, and literally times we'd say, okay, we have to move on. And then, you covered a lot of that early on, how do you reach out? And, and of course you all experience this, one question leads to another. We just thought, okay, we're all right here in our little world, in a sense, and maybe several counties or a watershed or in an area. And then we don't realize how broad reaching it can be, literally almost from Canada to the Gulf. In this case, up and down the Mississippi River. And then, that was one of the biggest, that's, those two things there. And then how do you reach out and, expose all of us that are involved in the practices that we do. If everyone does a little bit, it adds up, and that was one of the biggest hurdles that we came up with is some of the stuff early on that Jenny, you talked about, is how do you reach out and make those contacts?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jeff. And Mark, I don't know if there's any more you want to say about how you were hoping the curriculum could help support the work that you're doing in the Upper Soda, but I'm also really curious about, have any of the farmers that participated in the training acted on their experiences from the training?
Sure. First, I'll mention that American Farmland Trust was a relatively new organization in Ohio Watershed Management. And in addition, most of the attention in Ohio goes north to Lake Erie. So folks were somewhat unaccustomed to looking south, and the watershed that we are in sits at the very top of the Ohio River watershed. This opportunity somewhat fell in our laps, meaning the City of Columbus and the Ohio State University, they were asked to pilot test this curriculum, and in many ways they were looking for an entree into the agricultural community, and we're comfortable walking in that world. We have an ongoing project that essentially is looking to build a payment for ecosystem services in the watershed, because as I mentioned, the water does provide the City of Columbus. Roughly over 1 million people get their drinking water from this watershed. And we have well-established relationships with agriculture. So essentially, AFT became the ambassador for the City of Columbus and some Ohio State researchers, but we weren't drug into it. We saw several advantages to American Farmland Trust. First, as I said, it helped us garner some name recognition, helped us develop some program recognition, and hopefully some street credibility. Then secondly, I think this is an important point, because of our partnerships, this was really a gracious way for American Farmland Trust to share the stage. We were able to allow our partners, the City of Columbus and Ohio State and others, to also help present this curriculum, and as well as Ohio EPA, and it really strengthened our partnership. So I guess in terms of following up, we have had a couple of participants feel as if they were confident enough to host their own field day. And to their surprise, neighbors showed up, and it seemed to build some confidence in these individuals. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Mark. Jeff, I'm going to bring it back to you. What do you see as the value in trainings like Tap Your Potential for farmers?
The value, the way I'm looking at it is our awareness. You know, we're all out there busy doing our business, and we're applying what we need to apply and do what we need to do in our practices. This and what the biggest thing that I see in the value of this is and there's always some that they're going to do whatever they do anyway. But for those of us that are concerned and understand that every little bit adds up to a greater number, the awareness, and then of what is going on, and then if that's in your mind, then as you're making your decisions to move forward in your practices, you can incorporate those into your BMPs so that you can do your little part, and then the next guy does their little part. But that was the biggest thing. Is we have to be aware, and I can't do it all by myself and solve all the problems. But if a good number of us do it, then it adds up and keeps adding up until then we see a progress to the right direction, of what lessen the loss of nutrients and stuff that contribute to the problems that we were told, that we were shown is what's taking place, and see if we can start making an attempt to alleviate that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jeff. I have one question left for each of you. I'm going to first go back to Mark. Mark, since as somebody who helped facilitate and organize this training, I'm curious, what is one or two maybe key tips or takeaways that you got from organizing and facilitating the training, and that you might want to convey to others who are interested in organizing and facilitating it?
Well, first, as you mentioned, Jenny, this curriculum is ready to go. It's tailor-made and tested for your audience, and it's adaptable to your watershed. You can really use the pieces to interchange and present it. I guess I'll add that what I really found is that this was an opportunity for individuals to really begin to work on some of their leadership skills, develop some knowledge and fluency in the world of water quality. It's vital that farmers, when they're at the table with agency regulators and elected officials and others, that they be versed in the basics of water quality standards, use attainment, TMDLs. They don't need to be experts, but they need to have some idea on how to provide constructive feedback. And I think we were able to accomplish that. I think this curriculum provides that core knowledge for farmers to engage and to be at the table.
And any advice that you'd give?
Any advice? Well, certainly I think it helps to have one-on-one conversations in terms of recruiting participants. I had to make a lot of phone calls. I am fortunate to live in the watershed. I've had several relationships over the years. So if you can identify a key leader to help pull and recruit and encourage, do so with one-on-one conversation. You can't sit behind a desk and expect this really to gain traction. So that's my tip. It's not earth-shattering. I think we all know that, but get out and talk with people, meet them where they are.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. And that's actually a great segue to my last question for Jeff is, Jeff, do you have any thoughts or tips or advice on how practitioners can best recruit farmers to attend trainings like Tap Your Potential?
That is always the difficult part because you have to figure out a way to entice them, lack of a better term, to come to these meetings, to draw them away from like in my case today, I've got a whole lot of stuff going on. It's just blowing up. And, to come to these meetings, and Mark did very good, covered that very well. And it's sort of going to be a regional thing here in Northwest Arkansas. we're not in the crop fields, so you're dealing with a different body of individuals, chicken growers and that. I mean, figure out a way to get the word out to them and get them to come and borrow from Mark there to participate. And once they come, it's uncanny how much participation that you get out of them and how many will walk up and have one-on-one conversations like he just said. That is the biggest hurdle, is to get people to draw them in, because once they get there, they're there because they're interested, and then they become more interested, and then there's increase in participation. That is always whenever, and then our alliance on our watersheds things, and then and then the poultry company that I grow chickens for, and then the cattle stuff that I do, it is always they're always there. This is the question that you just asked. How do we get everybody to show up? And that's always the biggest hurdle. It always seems like when they come, everyone, when you leave, they've been satisfied, and you feel comfortable if you were there that everyone was getting information out of what they were hearing, and the interaction and the participation that took place was positive. But just to get them there, is a lot of time is the hardest thing, because everyone there is there for a purpose. They came. If they didn't have no interest, they weren't coming anyway. But they're there because they're interested in it. I've sat there and watched, and you can see all of a sudden, the enthusiasm picks up and the participation picks up. It's the hurdle of getting the people there to participate. And then, like when John led our deal last year, that was 2 years ago now. It started out kind of slow, but boy, once it got going, there was times that, it just had to be cut off because everyone got really involved.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jeff. So that brings us to the end of our panel discussion. And we're going to move into questions now. And you can have questions for John and I about the curriculum, or if you have questions for Mark and Jeff about their experiences, we're open to them. And I'm just going to do, if you bear with me, and I'm sure many of you have to do this too, reporting for your own institutions. I'm just going to do a quick poll just to get some demographic information from you all, and forgive me for it, but I got to do it. So while we're going into questions, I'm going to put that poll, and if you all can just give your responses. So this is now question time. So any questions that you have, we are open to them.
Hey, Mark. Wilson, I've got a question for you because I did the program in person. We did it over 2 weeks or 2 sessions. Your program was online and it was digital because of COVID. I watched it though, and I really thought it was excellent. Do you think there are additional challenges, or is there a difference between the in-person and the virtual?
I'm sure there's a difference. I would state that you're learning, you tend to learn, in my experience has been, you tend to learn from those who are fellow participants as much as you do from the instructors. So I think when you're virtual, you don't have that interaction with participants that you may have with the instructors. So that was one drawback. I think we did our best. I'm glad to hear you say that you thought it was an excellent presentation. We had a lot of folks who really made a good effort to, this was right at the start. The other challenge is that a lot of the participants, or some of the participants, were unfamiliar with the whole Zoom technology thing at the kind of the initiation of some of this virtual stuff. So.
Thanks, Mark. And there's a question in the chat from Rachel, and she asks, have you found one method that works best to get those individuals to an event? As you said, that's the hardest part. Yeah, I mean, I think what what Mark said earlier about the one-on-one conversations and sort of personal invitations are often the sort of gold standard for that, getting folks to an event. I think too, and I think Jeff was alluding to this in his response, I think finding the sort of influential farmers in your area that sort of have connections to other folks and might help bring more folks in could be another way to go about it. And, I'm also curious from folks here, since we're all sort of, doing similar work, if anyone has any thoughts on sort of successful ways that they have been able to bring farmers to an event.
I'll jump in, Jenny. One activity or format, I should say, that we have found has been embraced is we typically will ask a farmer leader to host maybe a small group, 5 to 7 people in his shop, maybe from 5:30 to 7 o'clock in the evening. Typically, pizza and beer will show up, and we'll just share experiences. Sometimes you need to prod each other and prompt each other, but typically, if you get 5 or 6 or 7 folks from that are familiar with each other, they'll open up and talk, and farmers learn from farmers first. I think that's an old adage that we've all heard, but it's so true. So if you get neighbors and friends together for an hour or 2 in the evening, that has worked well for us.
Great, thanks, Mark. Go ahead, John. It looks like you want to say something.
Oh, yes, I have another question. I got a question for Jeff. I was going to ask Jeff, just for Arkansas, do you think it would be a good approach to work through an organization like Farm Bureau to promote the program to their members, to get a good wide audience in Arkansas, for example?
Yes, I was sitting there just trying to think what Mark touched on, a lot of very parts that you usually draw, but now John, you just touched on something. Yes, you reach out to the groups of Farm Bureau, maybe like our alliance, and use some of their mailing list, and on our farm side, not for everyone, because it's the farm specific side, but the Farm Bureau is an excellent one, because I know I'm involved with that, and the individuals that's involved in that, they participate. And if the word was given to them, hey, can you spread the word out? Just let 2 or 3 other people know. Then it would be spontaneous, and spread. The contacting those groups would really broaden, and you would also be getting to the right group. That would be very positive. And other than just trying to put out a flyer for, let's just keep it on the simplest side, and and hope everyone sees it. But if you contacted those groups, we'll just use the Farm Bureau for an example, and there's other ones in different groups. And I mean, up here in Northwest Arkansas, in Northwest Arkansas, you could use Farm Bureau, and then there's a couple of other groups that we are the cattlemen's associations, because they're usually up here. Everyone has to do several things, and then down south and I'm not too familiar with the row crop structure of things, but I'm sure there's groups down there you could do the same way, and the word would get out, and that would be to the right individuals. And then back to Mark's thing, entice them in a little bit. It always works. It seems to always work. Don't do it too early in the day, especially if it's in the working season, so that they can plan their day to show up.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Any other questions, especially about using the curriculum, or how it might help your programming with farmers? You can also use the chat if you would prefer that. All right, we have a question in the chat from Amanda. Did the program fit for farmers across different generations, boomers versus Gen X versus millennials at the same time? That's a really good question. And I'd love to get Jeff and Mark and John's thoughts on this. I think, I can talk from the experience. I was part of the Ohio pilot with Mark, and I would say that there was kind of a, there were folks from different generations there. At least I think I'm remembering right, Mark. But yeah, I mean, I think it is sort of intended to sort of reach across the generations. I do think that maybe some of the younger generations of farmers tend to seem to be more interested in stuff like this at this point in time. And so, but I think trying to reach all across the generations is sort of the goal of the curriculum. And I'm curious, Mark, what you think, or John or Jeff.
Good, John.
For our program, it was not to a diverse, multi-generational group, but then again, we were specifically focusing on one pilot watershed organization. And so that, depending on the group you pick, may or may not provide that large multi-generation, but we definitely hit experiential group where the group was very different in their terms of what they thought or knew or had experience with coming in. And you could see that there were benefits for people that had different types of experiences, and that the conversations from that might have worked similar to if there was a multi-generation. But this, I believe the program would work well for a multi-generation audience. Jeff?
Yes, you covered that well. I mean, the group that was there, pretty much let's, for lack of a better term, we were all very similar in age and groups, but we came in from a few different directions, and everybody's interest got focused real hard. But back to the question that was posed to us on the millennials, I was involved with another committee or council, and we were and it was the same thing. The ones that were picked for this were very similar in age structure, and now we were diverse, but it was actually in a poultry setting. But the question was posed to us in the same format that the chat question was, and some of the assistants and the workers for our council were of the millennial age, and we turned and asked them. We gave the question was asked to us, and we gave our response similar to this, and then we turned and asked them. This one girl in particular that was very, volunteered to respond for her age group, and they look at things a whole lot different than we do. Not tremendously different, but certain things were more important, and some of the stuff that we qualified to be a higher priority, they pushed back. And in this case, I'm not sure how it would be. That's just so you know what it was asked a lot about is about some animal welfare issues, and then her particular answer was, and it was a lot about money, and they said, our group, my friends in my age group, and she was upper 20s, say 30 years old at the most, they were willing to pay more if they knew the history of where their food came from. We're not far from what, whether we're talking about chickens, corn, or this products. So you would approach the millennials in a different, they are going to look at this at a little different, through a little different sphere. Their glasses are going to be, a little different than what I'm wearing, possibly, to what they see and what they're willing. One practice that what I may think is, hey, this is what it is, and that one there, it's just going to be tugged along. That may be their main practice, and what I'm wanting to do may be the tug along practice. So that question is very legitimate. That if you get into a different age structure on the participants, on the, whoever's participating, whenever you have your group meetings, that needs to be addressed, because we were surprised that the answer that gal gave to us, and it was real, and then it was a big group, and it's going to be the same way with what we are and you all are going to try to accomplish here.
Thanks, Jeff. And I think that's, brings up a really great point and sort of comes back to, customizing the curriculum and the importance of, being able to tailor it to the audiences that you're trying to reach. And so it might come down to sort of, might need to customize the messaging to some extent to really reach the sort of audiences that you're trying to reach. Mark, did you want to say something in response to this, or I saw you unmuted yourself?
No, I'll pass. There's several other questions that we could perhaps get to.
Thanks, Mark. So Eric asks, are there methods in place to track progress over time, both to feed into evaluation, but also develop stories that trace a leader's progression? So it's a really good question, Eric. And we do, in the facilitator's guide, offer some guidance for evaluating any trainings that you might do. So we offer some sample questions, and we do encourage you, if you are to put on this training, to evaluate what might, how it changes your participants. And we are also interested as a project team in sort of understanding how you will use the curriculum. And so, at some point in time, we hope to follow up with folks who have used the curriculum to really understand how it's gone for them and sort of how it's been able to meet their goals. And again, in terms of developing stories, I think that's part of our encouragement to evaluate the training is to really follow up with the folks that that participate and sort of to learn what those stories that might come out of the training opportunity. See. So Michael asks, what measures of success in improving water quality have you used? Farmers and people in general want to know that what they do makes a tangible difference. I don't know. I'm curious, Mark and Jeff, maybe this is a better question for you all in sort of the work that you're doing, what you all are using in your watersheds to measure success.
Well, I'll jump in, Jenny. We have edge of field monitoring as well as in-stream monitoring that will provide some idea of what kind of loads we're getting and in areas in which we've had installation of BMPs. We also have an ongoing effort to model the watershed. Modeling is as good as the information you put into it, but the information's getting pretty good in terms of remote sensing and being able to look at historical land use, not only in cropping patterns, but also tillage and whether or not there's a growing cover. A lot of this is more and more applicable. We're also utilizing the USDA tool, the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework, ACPF. That's more of a predictive location for potential practices, but it certainly helps to start a conversation with landowners in the area. So yeah, it's vital that farmers know that what they are doing is making a difference, no doubt.
Thanks, Mark. Jeff?
In my part, I'll step in this in regard to my association with our Watershed Alliance. We have monitoring stations out there. We have a lot of, in the recent years, we've had a lot of intense rain events, which has created a lot of stream bank erosion. That is one, as far as the alliance goes on our watershed, is one of our larger problems. And then we're putting the individuals, connecting them to the organizations, whether sometimes there is financial assistance for their stream bank stabilization. The big problem is this is kind of a tough question insofar as, yeah, there's been several years of data collected, but you actually need more than several years of data collected to see, are we making progress, or do we need to look at, different models and different restoration projects or stabilization projects? This has been brought to the forefront recent is a couple of years, but you need many years because of the different, rain events and the different of dry weather, what like, I mean, last spring we had lots of high water, and then we've had a dry spring, dry summer, and then we've had a couple of heavy rain events in certain locations. So it skews data. And so you just kind of got to pile it in, and start drawing on the averages. But we have monitoring stations out there that is collecting information that we use. And, we are, in some, and we have enough working with some of our partners out there, some stream bank stabilization projects that we go out there and look and say, hey, we're not losing 8 foot of bank now here at this, it's staying. So, I mean, we know that. So we have eyes on visual knowledge that can't do it all, but like I was saying before, every little bit helps.
Thanks, Jeff and Mark. There's a question from James about, would you recommend a third-party consultant to play the role of facilitator or the local watershed project coordinator? I'm going to give you a non-answer, James. I would say it depends, and there are pros and cons to, I think, either approach. I think that the benefit in my mind of a local watershed coordinator doing it is that I think it helps to sort of build relationships and build rapport to sort of, be facilitating and organizing something like this. And, I think that maybe a pro of having an outside facilitator would be, again, sort of, if the watershed coordinator, for example, if you already have a farmer-led group and you're looking to sort of expand membership or whatever, and maybe you as a watershed coordinator want to be part of that that conversation around that, and so having somebody outside facilitate might work. But I'm curious, John and Mark, since you both facilitated, what your thoughts about that?
Well, I guess in the training that we did, I would be somewhat of a third party because I'm not the manager of the watershed, that I'm working in, or the watershed group, but I was with the extension service. And so as a water quality instructor educator, that's the type of program that I do. And as this program exists and we want other people throughout the basin and in Arkansas to use it, I would welcome anyone to use it, and then to use their discretion in how they want to do it. Certainly, we have watersheds that are more contentious and volatile as far as feelings and attitudes, and we've got watershed areas that are just much more calm and peaceful. And so the approach you would take, I think, would have to vary, and it depends. But still being an outside third party in Arkansas with the extension service is kind of like a key for a lot of locks. It'll work in a lot of different counties. Our organization's trusted. We just provide research-based information that's non-biased and facilitate conversations in general as extension personnel. And, it may be that some counties would prefer a local person from their county to do it, not a state person. Maybe I really think if you don't have a program in your watershed where you are, that you could start this yourself, and you could be the person that does it in your area. But then again, you may want to rely on others. And one thing I thought that I really liked about was the Ohio training. I think I called it Wisconsin earlier, but Ohio. The training involved a lot of different people from around the state. There was a natural resources director, there was a farm credit person, there was a farmer, there was a watershed manager. It's kind of a team approach. And I thought that worked really well. And so I just have to fall back, and I hate to give you such a long, wordy response, but the answer depends. And it's up for the person that wants to do it to decide. And then if you're on the fence, I think you would check in maybe with some other people and see what they think, but use your best judgment.
Thanks, John. So we have time for, I know it's 12:30 now, or I guess 1:30 if you're on the Eastern time zone. We have one more question I do want to get to. If you have to leave, feel free to jump on, but I want to make sure I honor this question, and then we'll wrap up. So this question is from Chelsea, and it's for Jeff. Did you consider yourself a leader in the community before the training? And then I think, Chelsea, the second part is sort of maybe for everybody here. Can anyone speak on any experiences participants had building confidence in those who may not consider themselves leaders or are not used to being in the limelight? So I don't know, Jeff, if you want to answer that first part of the question.
Yes, I'm very busy with what I do, and I don't usually give that a whole lot of thought. But just as you was asking that question, I focused on. Yes, I am. I have been president of several boards, and I have been asked to do things. I just think it's participation of what I do, but then as you read, Jenny read me the question, then yes, I am. I usually don't give it any thought, but as I gave it a thought, well, okay, here I am, leader of this, leader of this, leader of this, and then people come to me at different times with different questions, and as I'm answering this question, all of a sudden I'm recalling the phone calls that we get nonstop. Can you give us advice on this and this and this? So the answer, John's kind of laughing there because we go a long ways back. But the answer to that in one word is yes. I don't want to get too wordy, like I'll borrow his phrase there, which you can. Yes, I am. And it's just the way I've done lots of stuff. I've been very progressive in a positive sense. I'm maximum output, so I usually run pretty hard, especially in my younger years. I'm slowing down a little now. But yeah, that one word answer to the question would be yes.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. And I would love to open up the second part of Chelsea's question to everybody here who has done work with farmers. And I'll repeat that question, but it's in the chat if you want to read it. Can anyone speak on any experiences participants had building confidence in those who may not consider themselves leaders or are not used to being in the limelight? So I'm curious if anyone has thoughts to that question.
The most basic answer is yes, the people that participated increased confidence, I think, by looking at our program evaluations. We asked a question about confidence because we wanted to know if people were more confident or less confident. So Jenny and I think can only speak to the program that we did where we conducted, but I think the other answers might have to come from Jeff and Mark maybe on this question, because y'all may have interacted with some of the participants in the training and had follow up with them somewhere.
I'm just going to jump in real quick, and I would say, John, that's a really great point. And just to reiterate, that is sort of one of the goals and learning objectives of the curriculum, is to sort of instill that confidence. So especially among those that might not see themselves as leaders already. But Mark and Jeff, I'm curious about your thoughts.
The confidence in that, that's a little bit difficult. I'll try to make this quick. If individuals are very, have had an experience in their life of what they've done, very difficult to sway them away from it. If they've seen something, they might even look at it and they may even say, yeah, I can see how that's working, but I've tried that and it didn't work well for me. And so they're not going to, they're not going to vary, they're going to stay where they're at. And then so, and here where I'm at, a lot of times our confidence is real strong, and y'all would have to come in with some real strong, valid information and examples and people that had participated and made it work, because everyone around here, they're living off of their experience. And so it's hard to break that. And I'll just be honest, I've got a real hard shell up on that part when you start, suggesting I need to do this or this or this, and this will work. And if I've been in that area and I've tried lots of stuff and forgot I keep what works and forget what I haven't. But from past experience, if something did not work, then you just drop it. And if you've got an idea or something that you want for us to participate in or even use, it can be, our shell can be cracked, but you're going to have to come in with with data and experience, and people said, hey, this is we done. We've done it this way, and maybe we had a slight variation on how we executed it, and it did or did not work for us, and we won't vary from it. But our past experience is the confidence builder where and that's a hard one to break through.
Thanks, Jeff. Mark, anything to add?
Briefly, we had a few from an older generation of farmers, and while it wasn't openly stated, you can certainly see and tell that it was implied that some of the older farmers were looking at the younger participants in our course and saying, it's your turn to drive. So I think there is that opportunity to build some.
Mark, that's perfect.
Thanks, Mark. Well, that, and I appreciate those who stayed on. We took more time than we said we would, but thank you everybody for coming here today. And thank you especially to Jeff and Mark for sharing their experiences and insight. It was super awesome to have you part of this. And we hope that you, go forth and use this curriculum, and we'd love to hear about your experiences using it. And, if we can make it better, how we can make it, a better tool for you. So, I feel free to get in touch, and I will be emailing you all a follow-up, and you can follow up with me that way. And we will be, if you haven't noticed already, we are recording this, and this will be going online. And so, if you have colleagues who missed this and want to sort of learn about it, they are able to do so. So thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your days.